So you're saying that all along, women and men have had the same opportunities, always?
No, I'm basically saying that all along, hardly anyone had any opportunities.
Isn't the real problem that quite a lot of men, and also young men, are struggling to deal with the fact that women now are more in control of their lives than earlier?
I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that the idea that the West is a patriarchal tyranny is rapidly translated into the idea that young men who strive forward are to be regarded with suspicion because they're doing nothing but manifesting the same sort of tyrannical power that has kept women oppressed for the last 2,000 years. And I think that entire narrative is appalling, right to the core. So, and I don't see that it's helpful to anyone, because making young men weak or failing to encourage them to be strong, that's a better way of putting it, certainly does the young men no good, and it doesn't do the young women any good at all if they want to find a partner.
So you're saying that all along, women and men have had the same opportunities, always?
No, I'm basically saying that all along, hardly anyone had any opportunities. I mean, if you look at the history of the world, things really started to shift in about 1895, but before 1895, the typical person in the West lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is about 2/3 the UN cutoff for abject poverty by today's standards. And so what happened through most of the history of the world is that men and women struggled mightily together, sometimes at each other's throats, but mostly cooperatively, to keep the wolf from the door and the tyrant at bay. Life was very, 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 very difficult. And the fact that we survived it all meant that fundamentally we cooperated, despite the fact that we're rife with stupidity, ignorance, and malevolence.
But what's so terrifying with gender equality?
Nothing.
So purist.
Except when people gerrymander the data, it's like, what do you mean by equality? Do you want women to have their free choice or not? If you do, they're not going to pick occupations that are the same as the occupations men pick.
But we have structures today that women need to struggle. They need to take a step to have the possibility to become like a prime minister. As we talked before, we don't have had any prime minister in Sweden that have been a woman, for instance. We have a lower rate of female entrepreneurs. Men had a higher income than women in Sweden, even if they work with the same tasks. And we need to work with.
That's one that I would dispute.
We need to work with gender equality, I think, even in the lower class in schools, to learn kids how to play with dolls, or how to boys how. We need to. I think we need to learn boys to be more sensitive, but also young girls to become more self-confident. And I think that's very important to.
Well, the problem with that is the data indicate that the consequence of the policies that you're promoting have maximized the differences between men and women. So that isn't what it's doing. Now, that isn't to say that the movement towards egalitarianism is necessarily a bad thing, but a tremendous amount of that's being driven not by social policy, but by technology. I mean, you know, the narrative that we're fed now is that up until 1960, when the enlightened feminists developed their egalitarian doctrines, men had kept women down, and they finally rose. And the truth of the matter is that from about 1895 onward, there was a series of technological revolutions that were extraordinarily powerful in their impact, that allowed women to step forward free of many of the burdens that had kept them back in the past. Birth control being one of them, but only one. Sanitary facilities of all sorts, plumbing had a huge role to play, tampons had a huge role to play, as did sanitary napkins. All of these technologies developed that enabled women to move forward, with less biological impediments. So there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
Excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially in the case of engineering and nursing, that are mostly due to biological differences, and you cannot minimize that by social engineering. So, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, one of the things you want to ask yourself is that what is the purpose of setting up a society that offers maximal equality of opportunity? And one of the answers is that you maximize people's free choice. And if you maximize free choice, then you also maximize differences in choice between people. And so you can't have both of those.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, a sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.